Good evening. Welcome to the January 2026 presentation by the Bay Area Culinary Historians. Tonight we are very pleased to have Chris Beckman join us to speak on A Twist in the Tale, how the humble anchovy flavored Western cuisine. Chris Beckman, born in San Francisco, holds a PhD in Near Eastern archaeology, researching how material culture and subsistence shape civilizations. His fieldwork spans the Middle East, Africa, and Europe, where he has lived for the past 2 decades. Most recently, he completed a diploma in plant-based cuisine at Le Cordon Bleu. His aim is to champion the anchovy as a flavor and a flavor enhancer par excellence in plant-forward diets, as it has been used historically across Europe and Asia. Currently based in Melbourne, Australia, he is researching a forthcoming companion volume on anchovies in Asia. So please join us in welcoming Chris Beckman.
Well, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay? Perfect, great. Well, first off, thank everyone for attending, and thank you as well to our hosts for inviting me to be here. As someone who was born and raised in San Francisco Bay Area, it's a real pleasure to do this presentation today. And the talk that I'm going to do is going to focus on the historical role of anchovies in both French and British cooking and how they entered and exited their respective foodways. Now, the book goes into far greater detail, but I hope to give you a little taste of the wild ride anchovies have been on in Western Europe and America over the course of the last 2,000 years. And I think more so than any other fish, anchovies have been, they have a certain ambiguity in their status. And anchovies can become entangled with gastronomic trends, class, and larger questions of identity. And it's for exactly these reasons that I think anchovies make a wonderful lens in which to examine European and American gastronomic history. Now, if I can just figure this out right, I think this will take us to the next page. Perfect. Okay, so we'll begin with the French anchovy. And one of the things that was very interesting when I began the process of researching the book, and that really prompted and was the inspiration to write it, was the realization that anchovies are probably the most divisive fish in the West. And it's worth noting that in the East, I'm currently based in Melbourne, and in Asia, over 1 billion people eat anchovies every day. There's absolutely no baggage associated with anchovies in any form. And a matter of fact, just 2 days ago, I had nasi lemak, which is a traditional, I believe it's an Indonesian dish with chicken. It was chicken rendang. And then on the side, you have rice and salted peanuts and dried anchovies. And it's an absolute delight of a dish. And people throughout Asia consume anchovies daily, whether it's in fish sauce, dried, fresh, however, in whatever form. But in the West, anchovies have always been loved and hated at the same time and in different ways. So that's what we're going to kind of explore, what we get today. And the following slides are going to kind of illustrate how anchovies came into French cuisine in a very big way and then unceremoniously got booted out. So the first mention of a printed anchovy recipe was in Le Viande Taïwan in France. And the interesting thing about this recipe is what it reveals about the underlying medical paradigms that guided elite and aristocratic cuisine. So if we look at the sauce calls for, basically the recipe calls for a mustard or wine sauce, both of which were right in line with the prevailing humoral theories of the day. So as fish was considered both humid and cool, the trick was to pair the fish with a sauce that would counteract that with warmth and dryness. And in the course of writing the book, there were 7 to 10 articles that turned out to be really influential and kind of shifted my thinking about European gastronomy. And Rachel Loudon's article, Birth of the Modern Diet, was one of them. And in the article, she describes how dramatically elite food changed in Europe in the course of just 100 years. And for instance, at a medieval supper, say in the mid 1500s, everything would have been very foreign tasting to our modern sensibilities. But if we fast forward just 100 years, all the food would have been reassuringly familiar. And on the table in the late 1600s might be beef bouillon, oysters, anchovies, a roast turkey with gravy. And so what Loudon's really looking at in this article, she's looking at what prompted this culinary change. So basically, starting in the 1500s, physicians could no longer reconcile Galen's humoral theory that the four humors must be in balance with the advances being made in human physiology. And the way this all came about is because as physicians were digging up cadavers in graveyards, they couldn't match the human physiology to the humoral theory. It just didn't align in a meaningful way. Now, they consequently went on to develop new theories, all of which were incorrect, but that really doesn't matter for our story because what we're looking at is what opened the door for anchovies to enter elite aristocratic French haute cuisine. And this is what we see happening right about this time. And this was one of the major contributing factors that I think doesn't get looked at enough. So right about this time period, in 1650, around there, François Pierre de la Varenne publishes La Cuisinière Françoise. And sauces were essential to La Varenne's success, and he perfected a wholly new kind of sauce, and it was a sauce made with butter. Okay, and that was an absolute game changer. And for instance, if we look at one of his recipes, pike with a sauce, this is a perfect example because he uses butter, chives, egg yolk, lemon peel, a dash of the poaching water, simmers that, and the secret ingredient, of course, as you all know, is the anchovy. And so we suddenly see anchovies entering this aristocratic haute cuisine and having an immediate and noticeable impact. Because basically, the combination of anchovies and butter knocked the socks off diners. And it has to do with how the fat in the butter tempers the salty bite of anchovies. And here we're talking about sauces, but you can still get a perfect example of that. If you have a good piece of bread, you toast that bread, slather on some unsalted butter, and then put on a fillet, an anchovy fillet. Take a bite. That butter tempers it absolutely beautifully. And what you have is this marvelous 1 + 1 = 3. You just have this umami bomb that's been tempered in a way. So that's exactly what La Varenne's sauces were doing in 1651. And the book was a huge success and basically kind of became one of the Bibles for the next 100, 200 years. And it launches anchovies as a flavoring agent in aristocratic cuisine. So we next see anchovies having a significant impact in a cookbook in François Massilot's La Cuisinière Royale and Bourgeois. And in this book, anchovies basically soar to new heights because Massilot includes them all across the culinary spectrum. And suddenly he's putting them in kind of dishes that we didn't traditionally see. And it's becoming this kind of must-have ingredient in every cook's arsenal. And incidentally, Massilot was the chef de cuisine to Philip I. who was the brother of King Louis XIV. And Philippe was a total dandy and probably an absolute smash hit to be around. He cut quite the dashing figure around court. And I have a quote where he loved attending court nothing more than women's clothes, and quote, he excelled at dinner parties, end quote. Often attired in the dress of a poor shepherdess. So, I mean, if you wanted to have a smash hit dinner party, inviting Philippe the First was probably a guarantee, and you probably got anchovies in the bargain. Oh, let's see. I'm just trying to advance this. Why isn't this guy advancing? Here we go. There we go. Okay, and very soon after this, we see anchovies basically hit their high water mark in France. And now we're talking about the 1700s. And in Manon's cookery book, La Cuisinière Bourgeoise, which was published in 1746, it was the most successful cookery book of the 1700s. And one of the interesting things is if you note the title's feminine, hence it was the first major French cookbook that acknowledged women. And no doubt, a savvy publisher looked across the English Channel and saw the huge audience that British cookbooks, which were geared towards women, were making sales. And he cleverly changed the title. In any event, kind of more germane to our story is that Menon used anchovies with everything. And if there's kind of one lesson I think we can take out of French haute cuisine from this period, it's that anchovies match and pair perfectly with beef, veal, lamb, pork, rabbit, fowl. I think Menon even used them in sausages when he manufactured sausages. And he used them with fish and shellfish to basically deepen the flavor of the sea. And Menon was also a master of microdosing in that he has a recipe for duck with a duck sauce, and it calls for just half an anchovy. So we can see on the spectrum, he's using just a little smidgen of anchovy to add a very background hint of flavor to quite a number of them and jumping in full, embracing them fully. And so basically in the 1700s, what we're seeing is that anchovies had arrived in a big way in French haute cuisine. And just stepping back a bit, Italian cookery books of this period, you also find are loaded with anchovies. The Italians, by contrast, are using anchovies in a variety of different ways, unlike French haute cuisine cookery books, which are mostly using them in sauces of one kind or another. The British were also using anchovies, but in quite a different way, which we'll get to in the 1700s. And then the outlier is Spain. And in Spain, anchovies, the Spanish approach to food and seafood in particular was so hierarchical, and anchovies are so small that they basically were not eating anchovies at all. You're not finding anchovy recipes in cookbooks, nothing. They're just simply not there. So getting back to the French anchovy, what we're seeing is that anchovies have reached the very pinnacle, the very peak through the 1700s. And everybody who can afford them is eating with anchovies. And now we see, and then basically just touching again on this, the reason, again, was that anchovies make meats meatier. They make seafood taste more like the sea. And they add a foundation to veg in all kinds of ways. And so basically, anchovies elevate the umami of everything they cross paths with. And so the question becomes, well, why did they then fall out of favor in France? And the answer is because of Carême. And Carême, we know, is the cook of kings and the king of cooks. And one of the things Carême did was Carême looked back and prior to Carême, there had already been a period where they called it Nouvelle Cuisine because they had reorganized medieval French cookery and created Nouvelle Cuisine. But Carême looked back and said, there's still a lot of spices in the Nouvelle Cuisine. And so he removed all the excess spices that had still straggled in from the medieval period. But in the process, he kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater. And anchovies were minimized in Carême's cookery, sadly. And everything became all about his four La Grande Mère sauces, which we know as mother sauces, Espagnole, Velouté, Allemande, and Bechamel. And these are precursors to what really, the mother sauces that fully got developed with Escoffier. And these were intense, intense meat reductions, sometimes all day long. To make one of these sauces, you basically had to dedicate a day in the kitchen, starting with 10 pounds of meat often. It was incredible. So Carême's cookery book was an international blockbuster. It just defined French haute cuisine. And he was an incredibly shrewd guy. He's the first cook to ever include a photo of himself inside his cookery book. But he didn't do anchovies any favors. And what we see is that what Carême started, Escoffier finishes. And basically, in 1903, Escoffier published his masterpiece, Le Guide Culinaire. And this cookbook became the haute cuisine Bible in both good and bad ways. Basically, though, it became all about butter, 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 and some cream. And that became the new mantra. So Escoffier further refined Carême's cooking and got it down to its very essence. However, out of the 3,000 recipes in Le Guide Culinaire, only 24 contained anchovies. And basically, Escoffier relegated or ghettoized, as I like to say, anchovies to just hors d'oeuvres. So anchovies got pushed completely out of the picture. And the one bright spot in France in the 20th century, anchovy-wise, was traditional Southern French cuisine. And anchovies never went out of fashion in the South. So consequently, when we're talking about the French anchovy, we're really talking about two different anchovies, each of which is circulating in their own milieu. And day in and day out, the provincial anchovy has unassumingly enhanced the cuisine of the South and still does to this day. But the other anchovy, the one that made its way north to the City of Lights and haute cuisine, French haute cuisine, it has been kind of on a 400-year roller coaster ride. And after a mediocre career in the Middle Ages, the haute cuisine anchovy rose to the very pinnacle of fine dining around the world, only to fall from favor to hit rock bottom in the 20th century. And it really wasn't until the Nouvelle Cuisine of the 60s and 70s that the French anchovy came back into haute cuisine, but it never came back the way it was. Tant pis. Too bad for French haute cuisine because I think it lost something there, but it is making its way back and has a brighter future in front of it. So we're going to turn now to the British anchovy. And in contrast to French, the British anchovy circulates into and out of British cuisine in radically different ways, which is it's startling how different Britain is from France versus how different anchovies enter into Italy. They never kind of exited Italy. In Spain, anchovies were absolute latecomers, didn't arrive until the 20th century. So we'll begin with Samuel Pepys, and thanks to his delightful diaries, we know what a well-to-do foodie in the 1660s consumed. And one of the things they consumed were a lot of anchovies. And it's been written that, quote, Pepys grazed his way through the day at taverns, end quote. And much of that grazing was on salted anchovies. And Pepys ate them much as we would eat potato chips, which is to say, is like a salty wet. And tavern owners like to serve anchovies for exactly this reasons, just like a modern bar serves salted peanuts to get you to drink more. One of the things that often gets asked is where those salted anchovies were coming from, because it's a little cold, British waters. It's better for pilchards and sardines and baby herring and whatnot. And anchovies generally tend to be a little more south in the Bay of Biscay off France and northern Spain. But what we're finding is that merchants were importing luxury goods, and I'm speaking of things like rugs, spices, and so on. And occasionally a small barrel of salted anchovies would find its way into a ship's hold. So consequently, when they entered the British market, they were entering as an imported luxury good with a lot of status. So this kind of differed somewhat from France and French haute cuisine, where they didn't quite enter the same way. Now, at the same time, we have Pepys eating salted anchovies. In Britain, we have the development of ketchup. So basically, British traders were exploring the East, and in Sumatra and Java, they were searching for basically spices and porcelain. And they encountered two unanticipated items. And basically, they encountered arak, which is distilled alcohol, and ketchup, which was a fish sauce, a very traditional fish sauce. And if you think about it, of course, sailors took to these wholeheartedly because one of them, arak, quenched their thirst, and the other, ketchup, added a little smidgen of flavor to their otherwise dreary onboard fare. And the ketchup at that time was probably a very simple affair, much as fish sauce is still made to this day. And it's basically just mostly small anchovies, but I've been to a few anchovy fish sauce processors, and I can see a lot of bycatch sneaks its way in. But it's just basically fish sauce, salt, and maybe a little fresh water. It's allowed to ferment anywhere from 3 months to a year. It's drained and then bottled. Um, so back in England, what we see is ketchup became a big thing. And why not? Of course, it was an absolute flavor bomb. And it's not exactly clear to me how imported ketchup entered British society. Did it enter from the top down, which there is some evidence through elites? Because it was often sold in little like perfume bottles and almost, treated like a luxury item. Or was it more of a bottom-up phenomena with sailors requesting it from their wives? And my personal guess is that it entered both ways, but simultaneously, but it's not exactly clear. What Eliza Smith did is she basically reverse engineered a fish sauce, and then she crossed that with traditional British pickling. And this created a whole new kind of condiment. So you have basically a traditional Asian fish sauce, which they called ketchup, but it's now complemented with things like an array of spices, shallots, vinegar, wine, all the traditional spices and ingredients that they were using in British pickling, which had a deep tradition. So this new condiment really shook up British gastronomic traditions to its very core. And of her 40 recipes in the book that contain uh, either anchovies or ketchup, uh, basically, I consider Smith the original anchovy queen of England. Um, And if Eliza Smith was the anchovy queen, then I think Elizabeth Raffold was the patron saint of ketchup and condiments. And she included one or the other, or anchovies, in an astounding 144 recipes, which is absolutely shocking considering 100 years prior, they weren't really being used. And in Raffold's cookery book, we really see how the convenience of a pre-made flavoring agent, and I'm talking about either a ketchup or a more modified condiment, these were displacing traditional French sauces in English cookery. And this was occurring especially in middling households um, that could afford them. And so her flavoring agents were really a uniquely British development. They were eminently practical. They enlivened just about every dish they were added to in no time at all and for very little money. And it's difficult to kind of appreciate this in some ways because nowadays everything is such an umami bomb from, the flavored barbecue potato chips to a packet of instant ramen. I mean, everything is chemically engineered to deliver this wallop of umami everywhere we look. You go down any supermarket aisle and everything is just a bomb. But back in the 1750s, people basically got it through roasted meats. That was how you got umami. And so to be able to add a tablespoon to say a simple potage, a simple vegetable soup was a game changer. And it could transform them. And basically it was at an incredibly cost-effective way. Um, so the Industrial Revolution really expanded the market for these anchovy products. And warehousemen who sold imported goods became perfectly situated as importers to initiate the mass production of ketchups because they were already importing things like luxury goods, fine fabrics, spices, anchovies. So they're perfectly positioned to start generating their own kinds of commercially available um, condiments and ketchups. And just as a side note, the artist who sketched this illustration, because it's quite stunning, for Mrs. Holt's warehouse, it's none other than the acclaimed British English artist and social critic William Hogarth, one of my particular favorites. And this whole period has lovely satirical illustrations. And we'll see on the next slide another example of one of these wonderful satirical drawings. This one by Rawlinson. And kind of the key takeaway for me is that sauces were all very carefully considered before customers handed over their hard-earned money. And I love this particular image because the seated guy in the chair on the far right appears to have his favorite, which he's, holding up. And the poodle's clearly trying to move in closer to investigate. And it's just an absolute charming scene. And my guess is that possibly up to 50% of the sauces in this shop would have contained anchovies. So beginning by the 1800s, most shopkeepers across the country stocked industrial condiments in one form or another. And although many of the poor could still not afford them, the convenience of these condiments ensured that every household with the means had a bottle or two on hand. And I'm sure you guys recognize all of these. They're still being produced to this day. Um, these went on to shape in a very kind of profound and meaningful way British cuisine at the time. And although aristocratic elites still leaned towards French haute cuisine, there was developing a significant middling class, so to speak. And in every household, you could find these condiments. And anchovies, right along with the condiments, were experiencing kind of a heyday right up until Mrs. Beeton, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with her cookbook. It's rightly lauded in many circles. I have a more challenging relationship with her because even though it was a monumental blockbuster, and even though it didn't merely outsell its competitors, it crushed them. And it's said to have never been out of print to this day. For all its success, uh, Beaton was not very kind to anchovies or anchovy-based condiments. And I racked my brains trying to get to the bottom of this, why there were so few anchovy recipes, and what accounted for me this huge gastronomic misstep. And after months of researching and emailing colleagues, my personal belief is that she simply did not like anchovies. And it's very interesting because Mrs. Beaton, she went and basically strip mined in the course of compiling her recipes. She strip mined earlier recipes, but when she went into a cookery book like Mrs. Raffles' cookery book and went into, say, the fish recipes and took, say, 20 fish recipes from Raffles, she carefully avoided every single one that had either ketchup or an anchovy added to it, which is very interesting. So the sad part of all this is that anchovies never really recovered from this period. And it's also right around this time that we start seeing brown sauces come in to um, start making their presence felt in a big way. And brown sauces are sweeter and the tangier than a traditional ketchup. And part of that reason is that they're less savory and sweeter and tangier is because they left anchovies out. And these brown sauces derive their distinctive flavors from dried fruit like raisins, dates, dried mangoes, oranges, as well as sweeteners like molasses and imported spices. You know, often they would have things like star anise in them. So HP sauce basically conquered Britain, and it became the best-selling condiment that completely dominated the market. But it was another brown sauce that went on to conquer the world. And we know that sauce very well in the States. I grew up with it. I loved it. Of course, it's called, I'm sure you guys all know it very well. It's A1 sauce. And A1, again, is a brown sauce without anchovies. Um, so after Mrs. Beaton, we don't really see anchovies having nearly the same prominence up until basically the 60s. And a lot of that goes back to Elizabeth David, who published French Provincial Cooking, which was hugely successful in Britain. And she kind of single-handedly reintroduces anchovies back to the British public. And then shortly thereafter, you get people like Marco Pierre White in his search to turbocharge his food, starts adding anchovies to everything to ramp up the flavor. He had one recipe. It's basically a grilled Angus strip loin with Café de Paris butter. And his Café de Paris butter was basically his take on a traditional Café de Paris butter. And it was filled with anchovies and mustard, all kinds of ingredients. It basically rocked the glitterati's world. And his protege, Gordon Ramsay, followed suit and included anchovies in a ton of different recipes. And you can see there's Marco Pierre White in the center. People love him and loathe him in equal measure, kind of like anchovies. And then to kind of wrap things up, I want to talk about Nigella Lawson. Not only did she kindly lend a quote to my book, but Nigella, as I went back, and the reason we approached her for a quote is she has consistently championed anchovies more than any other British cook. And she has a wonderful quote in Cook, Eat, Repeat. And she says, quote, "For cooks, and certainly, if not emphatically, for this cook, anchovies are of the essence. Few other ingredients arrive in the kitchen with such confrontational pungency, and yet manage to imbue so many dishes with such transformational subtlety." subtlety. And I think that kind of hits on the power of anchovies in cookery because anchovies can really be added uh, to anything. They can be added to meats, to fish. They work wonderful with vegetables, broccoli, spinach, kale. Incredible in pastas, in risottos. You can have them cooked in, you can have them raw. It really is an amazing way to flavor our food. And if there's kind of one takeaway from today, it would be that to revisit and look back in the past at some older recipe books from 17, 1800s, and they're filled with the recipes with anchovies. And I think that's something we would all benefit from. So on that note, thank you all for your patience. And I'll turn things over to the host if he would like to open things up.